Okay, hello everyone. My name is Tara Alfano. I am the Director of Development for the College of New Rochelle alumni here at Mercy College. I'm also a graduate of the College of New Rochelle. Welcome to everyone who's joining us here in person, and welcome to everyone joining us by Zoom. For those of you joining us by Zoom, I just want to let you know this session is being recorded, and the recording and materials will be available to you at a later time. I will send an email out to everyone. For those of you joining us by Zoom, if you have any questions or reflections, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. My colleague Noel will be taking your questions and your reflections and sharing them with our panel speakers. Before I get started, I would like to first thank all the College of New Rochelle Legacy Council members, some of whom are here today, for their hard work and dedication in helping to create this meaningful and impactful series. I would like to especially thank Marlene Tutera, who is unfortunately not able to be here with us today, and co-chair of the Legacy Council, Rosa Napoleon. Thank you. The reason we named this series the Sister Dorothy Ann Kelly Lifelong Enrichment Series is to honor the legacy of Sister Dorothy Ann Kelly. Sister Dorothy Ann, for those who do not know, was former president for the College of New Rochelle from 1972 to 1997, and she passed away in 2009. Sister Dorothy Ann was a lifelong learner, a mentor, an advocate, transformative educator, peacemaker, and a gifted leader who sought opportunities for all people. I unfortunately didn't know her personally, but from what I've heard, she has deep compassion and devotion for education, and it was undeniable. For her, everyone deserved an opportunity. So what better way to recognize and honor a remarkable human than to see her legacy continue through lifelong learning. So this series is going to be going on. It's going to happen twice a year, once in the fall and once in the spring / summertime. And it's going to be topics of various different degrees. Today is our inaugural series, and it's titled Universal Loss and Grief, something I believe we all can relate to in some way or another. Now I would like to welcome all of you and introduce to you our panel speakers. First speaker is Carol Corliss. Carol earned a BA in psychology and a baccalaureate certificate in social work from the College of New Rochelle in 1975, as well as a master's in elementary education from Nazareth College in Rochester in 1996. She is retired now several years ago as a career in parenting education. She is the author of a book called Yanking Bittersweet, Stories of Widows Coming to Terms with Grief. Our second panelist is Catherine Bell Kempthorne. Catherine earned her bachelor's in English from the College of New Rochelle in 1975. Now retired, Catherine was an employee of Hospice of the North Shore Center for Grief and Healing in Danvers, Massachusetts. Our third panelist is Mary Ellen McEvely. Mary Ellen earned a bachelor's degree in English from the College of New Rochelle in 1965 and a master's in English from Fordham University. Mary Ellen was a volunteer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, chaplaincy services, and hospice services at Bellevue. All three women come here today with personal experiences of loss and grief and coping, and will share their stories and reflections with all of us. Thank you, and let us begin.
Yes, thank you, Tara. So we're going to start out, each of us is going to just take a couple of minutes to give you just a little bit of information about our own experiences with grief and with mourning. And as Tara mentioned, I recently wrote a book titled Yanking Bittersweet. I started work on the book in 2018, shortly after the death of my second husband. He died very suddenly of a heart attack, and that left me a widow for the second time in my life. I was 62. My first husband, Jim, died in 1989, and his was the last in a series of very closely spaced losses. Those losses included the deaths of our daughter and our younger son. They both had a neuromuscular disease and died in infancy. Now, those were very long ago losses, and the impact of them, I guess one might say, had softened over the years, as it tends to do. But when Gary died a few years ago, those losses really became quite vivid and visceral to me again. And it wasn't long after Gary died that both of my parents also died in their 90s. So it was around that time that I began to think, I got to go somewhere with all of this loss. I have to make something positive come out of this. And that got me to thinking about writing something about grief. I really didn't at that point want to tell my own story. I thought, who am I? You know, I'm not a celebrity. I'm not a I'm not a person in public life. I have never written a book before. You know, who am I? Who's going to know me? But I did feel comfortable in trying to collect the stories of other widows and trying to put something together in that regard. So I interviewed other widows, 20 of them, wrote up their stories, wrote up some information that was more general to grief. And I started showing that to a few friends just to get some of their feedback on it. One of those friends is in the room right now. She was with me at the very beginning. Leslie, I'll give a shout out to you. And I would say one of the comments that I got from anybody that I showed it to at that point was, well, where's your story? People are going to want to know your story. And I really wasn't convinced yet at that point, but then someone told me about something that Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and writer, something that he had said. And I want to get the words right, so let me read it. He said, whoever survives a test, whatever it may be, must tell the story. That is his duty. So I did start to write my own story. It was a wrenching process, but it has brought about wonderful blessings in my life. It's really put me in touch with so many others who've been so gracious about sharing their stories with me. And it's brought me here today to see you and meet you. So I'm going to hand it over to Gert, who will give you some of her perspective on her own personal experiences.
Hello? Does it work? Oh, Gert. Let's start with that. My name is Catherine Bell Kempthorne, but when I was in college, my nickname was Gert as a Should I start over? We'll start with Gert. My nickname in college was Gert. My middle name is Gertrude, hence the nickname. Coming from an Irish Catholic family, which many of us here do. Firstborn daughter was Mary. My grandmother, whose name was Gertrude, my paternal grandmother, was miffed at my mother for not naming her Gertrude. So when I came along, the second daughter, she graced me with Gertrude as my middle name. So while I am Catherine Bell Kempthorne to a lot of the world, I was afraid that colleagues and friends would slip and call me Catherine. Just wouldn't know who was speaking. Too confusing. So from here on in, it's nice to meet you. I'm Gert. It's nice to see you all here. This is my story. In 1999, my father passed away from lung cancer 3 months from the time of diagnosis, which was pretty shocking that it happened so quickly. We had not experienced a ton of loss in our lives, and I'm from a fairly large family, so it was a devastating revelation when my mother called me at work and said, "Daddy's gone." At the same time that was happening, I sadly was going through a divorce, which is a loss of another kind. About a year after that, my ex-husband passed away from bladder cancer, and he died in my living room. I brought him home to care for him. I wasn't going to leave him alone at a time like this. Um, he is the father of my two daughters, one of whom is here today, but two grandchildren, so out they went. If you think about it, and we're talking about loss today, we did lose him twice. We lost him through the divorce, and then again when he so sadly passed away at age 55. When I was preparing for today and thinking about all these things, and my team knows this, I had an overwhelming sense of nervousness and anxiety, and I couldn't understand because I've done tons of public speaking in my life, and I'm usually feeling pretty comfortable about it, but I was undergoing a strange emotion. And when I explained this to my new husband, and I guess I shouldn't call him new, it'll be 20 years on New Year's Eve. He said, "You're probably reliving those feelings, reflecting on it, and it's making you sad again." He's just a peach, I'll tell you. So sometime later, I went to work for this hospice organization in Danvers, Massachusetts. And I think it's very interesting that I went to work for the Center for Grief and Healing. Yep, I knew all about that. I managed a corps of 300 volunteers. We designed, developed, and delivered support groups, and we deployed volunteers all over the North Shore for at-home care. I think that it was some of the most gratifying work I have ever done. We call it truly God's work, for people to give of their time and their hearts to bring some kind of comfort, companionship, or something to those who are grieving. That's my story.
I am Mary Ellen McEvely, and I graduated from CNR in '65, but at that point I wasn't Ursuline. I later withdrew from the Ursulines on very good terms, and soon met a widower with 6 children, Tom McEvely. You should have heard my father's reaction when he said, "Does this man have children by any chance?" And I said, 6. And he said, "I want to meet him right away." Anyway, it worked out splendidly. Tom died on September 15th, 2015. He was at home in hospice with me, with the Visiting Nurse Service of New York, about which I cannot say enough. They were just really splendid. That morning, the nurse came and told me that he would die before the end of the day. There are 6 McEvely children. 4 of them were in Westchester, and they were at the Manhattan apartment where we lived by noontime. One arrived late in the afternoon, and Ellie, the oldest daughter, arrived at 8:04 p.m., and Tom died at 8:14. And we all gasped because we knew absolutely that he waited for her to come. The funeral rituals sustained me. It was a military funeral with cannon and folding of the American flag and presenting that to me also. There was a luncheon because a lot of people had come from a distance, and so it was some time later that I was finally alone back in the apartment. And I did stuff like tidying up unnecessary stuff that was already tidied up, and just sort of wandered around. And then I was hit with the fact that where was I to put the unfathomable idea of absence? His absence was so alive to me that it was just awful. We had volunteered together at Sloan Kettering in the chaplaincy services, and I went back to that, but Sloan Kettering requires that you wait a certain number of months after the death of a spouse before you do go back to service there. I walked to Carl Schurz Park, which was at the end of East 86th Street on the East River in Manhattan. And I spent a lot of time there sitting in the grass, watching the activity on the East River. I cooked balanced meals. I bought a pack of 3-ring paper and a big binder, and I started writing every day. And I tried to do what Sam Levinson suggested. Don't watch the clock. Do what it does. Keep going forward. I went back to Sloan Kettering to volunteer. I also took a course in hospice work with the Visiting Nurse Service of New York, and then worked at Bellevue until they closed their hospice unit. And so I came through the first year. But during that year, I developed a really serious desire for a teddy bear. And I was so appalled that I, as an adult woman, would want a teddy bear. And I walked to toy stores on Madison Avenue and looked in the window and priced them. Fortunately, no one ever asked me why I wanted a teddy bear. I didn't buy one, and I told no one except a niece one day in a conversation. And a couple of weeks later, a wonderful teddy bear arrived in the mail from her, of course. I just addressed it as bear. I have it to this day. And on occasions when I think I have to speak out loud or I will burst, I address it. And the response is always understanding and always deserves a big hug. That's it.
Thank you both. I'm going to just do a mic check with everybody here. So do you need us to be holding this really close? Okay. Pardon me? Sure. Okay. So we'll try to bear that in mind. None of us are comfortable with mics. Sure. Okay. So we'll try to remember not to move our hands. Okay. We'll do better, folks at home. Okay. So now you know a little bit about us. I do think it's important at this point just to point out one thing, even though we've all had some experience in the bereavement world as helpers and also as receivers of bereavement services, and none of us are professionally credentialed as grief counselors or as therapists. So we need to make that clear. Our time today is hopefully going to be informative and enriching, but it won't be therapeutic. So just want to have that clear with everybody. Okay, so that we're all knowing what's going to be happening for maybe the next hour and a half, we're going to take a look just at the outline for our time together. And it should be appearing, there it is up on the screen. We'll go through that just briefly. So we're going to first take a look at what is loss. What does that mean? And not only loss from death, but also loss that involves many other characteristics. And then Gert is going to lead us in an exploration of common grief reactions and some factors that affect how we react in a grief situation. At that point, we're going to take 15 minutes roughly for you to ask questions or contribute your own perspectives on these topics. We do ask at that point that you try to keep your comments brief. so that as many people as want to speak can have a chance. And we'll try to be aware of those folks who are Zooming in with us to take their comments and questions as well. So after that, we're going to talk just briefly about tasks of mourning, the steps that we have to take to try to overcome grief. And at that point, Mary Ellen is going to explore some actual strategies that might promote healing and resilience. At that point, we'll take another break for comments and questions and perspectives. And then we'll wrap things up with just some meditations on trust and hope and healing. And then before we leave, there will be some closing comments from Rosa Napoleon. And so that's what's in store for the next hour and a half. Lots to cover, but I think hopefully it will be something that you will find enriching. So let us get started. The title of today's program, Universal Loss and Grief, implies that we all humans experience loss and grief at some point in our lives, maybe many times during our life. It's part of the human condition. I would guess that most of us here have, at some point in their life, probably many times, have used the expression, "I'm so sorry for your loss." We write that in condolence cards. We say it at funerals. When we hear somebody say, "Oh, he or she has had so many losses," we kind of jump to the conclusion, logically, that we're talking about deaths in that regard. So loss in that sense is an acknowledgement that someone has died. And it's also an acknowledgement of the terrible impact that has on those who are left behind. But loss from death is not the only type of loss. So we're going to take some time right now to look at some other ways in which humans experience loss. One of those that Gert brought up is the loss of a marriage, the loss of a relationship. Often that's because of divorce. It can also be more subtly the loss of a marriage through infidelity or through substance abuse, through domestic violence. Perhaps it does not result in divorce itself, but the marriage itself breaks down. We even talk about these sorts of things as being the death of a marriage. I've heard from lots of people who have been divorced who really find an affinity with people who have been widowed. Many of the same sorts of circumstances crop up in the wake of both of those situations. So loss of a marriage is a biggie. Anybody who's lost a job knows how destabilizing it is. There's a whole cascade of losses that take place when that happens. Obviously, loss of income, but also loss of self-esteem, loss of self-confidence, loss of those coworker relationships that become important to us when we're working. So many losses that are also part of that initial loss of a job. I think we'd all agree that natural disasters seem to be in the news on practically a daily basis at this point. Tornadoes and earthquakes and hurricanes and floods, wildfires. And when those sorts of things happen, frequently it is something as basic as a person's home that is lost to one degree or another. Home is no longer the safe and secure place that it always has been. It might look hopelessly different. The landscape has become disturbingly surreal. Maybe the house, the home, is completely swept away by the fire or the floods or the wind. So it's hard to imagine how difficult it would be to go on knowing that home and belongings are all gone. It's impossible to ignore also the fact that we have war raging on so many fronts across the world. And war comes with its own host of losses. Obviously, loss of life, loss of a sense of security, loss of basic necessities, and loss of the homeland in extreme circumstances. Health issues also bring about a great deal of losses. I mean, every broken bone, every joint that's no longer working well, like this thing here. Hello. Oh, there we are again. Okay, it's got like a sweet spot. Yeah, medical issues, health issues. They wear us down. They rob us of our feeling of well-being, either physically or mentally, maybe both. Loss of memory. Some of us in this room are reaching that age where we are not remembering things the way we used to. And so loss of memory, even if it's on a very minor basis, is it's disturbing, a loss to be contended with. COVID-19 brought about a whole host of losses, loss of companionship, loss of the ability to get together with family and friends, to say nothing of the loss of life, loss of routines, loss of the way we went to school, loss of the way we went to work. So we've got all different kinds of losses that we may not always think of as being losses, but they are losses nonetheless. And to a certain extent, we grieve all of those losses. And in just a bit, Gert is going to talk a bit about those grief reactions. But, before we all get totally depressed about this, now that I've sketched out all these awful ways in which we experience loss, I'd like us to just remember one thing, and that is that because loss is universal, try to embrace the notion that because of that, we are a community, all of us here, all of us on Zoom, all of us in the world, so to speak. We are a community that has a common bond. We're each other's sounding board. We're each other's shoulder to lean on. We are each other's saving grace. And so to just focus us a bit on that before we move on a little more towards grief, I'd like to just offer you a quote from Helen Keller. She said this obviously decades ago, but it still resonates today. She wrote, When it seems that our sorrow is too great to be borne, let us think of the great family of the heavy-hearted, into which our grief has given us entrance. And inevitably, we will feel about us their arms, their sympathy, their understanding. I'm going to read that a second time. And if you feel comfortable, I'm going to invite you to just close your eyes and really hear the words. And while you're hearing these words, to allow yourselves to feel embraced by everyone who's in the room, embraced in love and understanding. When it seems that our sorrow is too great to be borne, let us think of the great family of the heavy-hearted, into which our grief has given us entrance. And inevitably, we will feel about us their arms, their sympathy, their understanding. Humans, to some extent, grieve all the losses, whether they be from death or from other circumstances. Grief is the emotional response to loss. So Gerd is going to lead us in an exploration of this. And what a lot of the material that she has to share sort of has a bias towards grief as it relates to the loss of a person, the loss of a life, a death. However, much of what she has to share is applicable to many other forms of loss. So I want you to try to keep that in mind as we're going through that. Gert, your turn. It's got to be really close. Sorry.
Well, I hope this is appropriate that I add a little levity here. It's kind of a heavy topic that we're dealing with today. When I worked at Hospice of the North Shore and the Center for Grief and Healing, we did not accept drop-ins. Everything was scheduled and people had to call ahead and all that sort of thing. Our intake person, whose name was Patty, answered a call one day, and there was a very, very hysterical man on the phone saying, "My boy's gone, my boy's gone." And she came out and scrambled with the grief counselors and me and anyone else who would be willing to help to pull together materials on loss of a child and grief and all the same things that we're talking about. He asked if he could come into the office, and we all agreed. He sounded almost desperate. So of course we welcomed him in, all the while crying and saying that his boy was gone. And his wife was surprisingly calm and beautifully dressed. And we had asked him, was your son on hospice or no, was he on hospice? Was this sudden? And what was your son's name? And the man said, Bandit. And so Patty, the social worker who was dealing with them, came out into the hallway and said to Patty, the intake person, "It's a dog." Might have been the hardest time we all laughed ever, but loss of a pet is equally as difficult as any other sort of loss. So I just kind of wanted to start off with just a little smile. So let's talk about common grief reactions. My goal today in speaking with you is to convey that no matter how you react is particular to you, that there is no one way to grieve, that it's different for everybody. It has, there's not a right way, there's not a wrong way. It is whatever you react to. It's critically important that you accept it as normal. Some people grieve for years and can't seem to put that behind them. Some people seem to bounce right back quickly, and that's perfectly fine for them too. Here's a list of some of the common feelings of shock, bewilderment, numbness, sadness, denial, anxiety, guilt, anger, loneliness, depression, relief. Any of those resonate with anybody? Grief has no timetable, and some people will say, "Well, I'll feel better in a year, or I'll feel better when the holidays are over." And you cannot have you shouldn't have any expectations, because grief can roll over you at any time. I was in the car with my new old husband, and my wedding song from my first wedding came on the radio, and that was "You Fill Up My Senses" by John Denver. Burst into tears. It was probably 17 years after Jim had died, and my current, hopefully my last husband, said, I feel so sad for you. And we call these grief bursts. They come from the depths of your soul, and I would imagine we've all experienced those. You don't know where they come from, why or when. I thought that I was, long past the acceptance phase that my husband was no longer here, but that just doesn't happen. So keep grief bursts in your mind, and never ever feel that so many people want to deny their grief. And for health reasons and many other reasons, it's so best to try to deal with it. A very dear friend of mine, who was also a classmate of ours, said to me when Jim died, and it's the best piece of advice I ever got: "You cannot go over this. You can't go under it. You can't go around it. You have to go through it." And I found that helped me in so many ways. I think it's I can't come up with the right words, but just to say that anybody who's experienced any kind of loss, and as Carol named so many, it's normal. Whatever it is, it's normal. It's an inevitable part of life, and something that everybody will experience at one time or another, if not multiple times. And I forgot my book. Here are some tips that might help. We have, I took these straight from the 5 Stages of Grief by Benet Books. Have you ever heard of that? And here are a couple. We won't belabor these points, but allow yourself to grieve in your own way. There is no one right way to deal with grief, and what works for one may not work for another. What matters most is that you allow yourself to feel the emotions that come with it. Don't bottle up your feelings. Grief is often emotional and overwhelming, leading to feelings of guilt or shame if they're not appropriately expressed. It's important to talk about your feelings with someone who will understand and support you. I have a very, very dear friend whose husband dropped dead of a heart attack while on vacation in Sanibel Island. That was 22 years ago. She is still grieving outwardly, tears, to the point sometimes you just want to shake somebody. But you have to stop and say, this is her coping mechanism. She'll never recover, and that's okay. I mean, that's not okay. We don't want her to live life on a sad path. But for her, this is her reality. Don't overdo it. It's impossible to let go of things, but it's equally important not to lose yourself in your grief. Remember that it is a process and that you need time to heal. Some of the factors that affect the grief response are, and I won't go through all of them, but familial relationship to the person who died, spouse, child, parent, sibling. And when I get a little cuckoo. emotional closeness or estrangement from the person who died. When I worked at hospice, I really advocated for a support group for people who felt glad that a person died, which is an emotion that I imagine a person feeling that way struggles with. Maybe it was, as Carol mentioned, an abusive relationship or, bitter divorce or something. And people say, I'm glad he or she is not here anymore. And once again, that's okay. People need to deal with the emotions as they come along. And if somebody says, I'm glad the so-and-so is dead, that's got to be a horrifying emotion of guilt to feel that way about someone. But it's different for everybody, so it's okay. Circumstances of death, was it sudden? Was it after a long illness? Was it a suicide or an accident or a crime? My first husband died 5 months from diagnosis of bladder cancer, as I mentioned. And I used to use the analogy with my daughters that even though we know daddy's going to die, it's not going to change how you feel when it happens. So if I said to you, I'm going to break your arm in a month, you say, oh, okay. 3 weeks later, I say, it's a week away, Carol. I'm going to break your arm. And then I come and I break your arm. It hurts just as much as through the whole time. When Jim was sick, we knew he was going to die. That didn't help the pain of it. One's age and gender. And I hope this won't be inappropriate. My brother-in-law's sister passed away at age 35. And my mother and father and I went to the funeral in upstate New York. There were at least 1,000 people. We were in the funeral cortege, and my father, like every Irish Catholic patriarch, used to start every sentence with Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, this is the biggest funeral I have ever been to in my life. And my mother said, well, John, that's because she was so young. And, when you and I go, there aren't going to be that many people left. And he said, and those that do, don't give a. I don't want that recorded. One's previous experience with loss and one's coping style. Availability of social supports is very, very important. There are tons. Just Google it. There are books and support groups, and I'm sure you know about tons of these things. And take advantage of those resources. I'm going to close with something I found where the author is unknown. And I figured since the author was unknown, why don't I pretend that I'll take credit for it? They'll never know. What I've learned from life is that for every inch of sadness lays a foot of happiness ahead. I've learned the simplest of times brings the grandest of pleasures, and the hardest goodbyes often lead to the best hellos. I've learned that crazy chances guide us to unexpected discoveries, and that tough times unveil the sincerity of people. I've learned that you have to hold on to your smile every day and free yourself of that frown. And now, we will take this time to invite you to share, reflect, question. Ready, set, go.
Is it on? Yeah, it is on. Question.
Oh, good, thanks.
Thank you. I wanted to start by saying thank you, but also make a comment that Another gift that the College of New Rochelle gave to all of us was in the person of Professor Dr. Ken Doka. And I don't know how many of you may have come across him in the past, but he coined, this was an area that he worked in for many, many years. In fact, he chose it for his doctoral work. And he coined the phrase disenfranchised grief, which meant any kind of grief for which you personally don't think you're entitled. So for example, if you were not close to somebody, but you go to a funeral and you find yourself deeply affected, it's really embarrassing to know if you're sobbing at a funeral of a hardly known person, but that it strikes you in some way. He used the example of September 11th. The matriarch of his family, his grandmother, was in her 90s and she died. And everyone was in shock and in a state of grief over the losses at the World Trade Center and around the country. And he said that people said when he explained that he had been at his grandmother's funeral, they were like, oh, well, yeah, but she was old. I'm sure she had a full life. So that is, I think, something for us to all be aware that your example, many people might assume that you would not have done that for a divorced husband, and I just think it's one more way to be aware, and that's a resource. Look up anything by Dr. Ken Doka. He's known around the world.
Thank you, Eileen. Also, I just want to say that we have some materials and at the end of that will be available afterwards along with this recording. And one of the things is there's a bibliography, and one of the references is Ken Doka. So.
It's not a question really. My mother lost her mother when she was a child. She was 10, came from a family of 5 children, and her father, who was Scotch-Irish, very stern, was so proud at the funeral when none of the children cried. So you can imagine that was something my mother never talked about. And so that's how we were raised. If somebody dies, you don't cry. And certainly going into social work, which I later did, I had to read all these books to learn anything about grief. I never remember crying over any loss because that was the learning. And one of my biggest teachers was Carol. When she was going through her husband's loss and her 2 babies, she would talk to me. We were friends in social work and outside of social work. And she would say, oh, you've given so much to me by listening. And I said, no, Carol, you've given me so much. My listening to you, I now can reflect on what grief is, what the stages are, and what's allowed. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart, not only for me, but from people I'm working with. Do you remember my saying that, Carol? So you're sharing with others rather than a burden can be such a gift.
Thank you, Leslie.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. So similar to my colleague who just mentioned just a little bit of what she said. I've experienced grief from a young age. So you just alluded to recently 9/11. So my 4th grade teacher at the time, he had a daughter that worked on one of the towers. She was one of the people that were of the many that were killed on 9/11. And that was his final year of teaching. Like after he had, attended to her funeral, did what he had to do in terms of his process of grieving. He said at the end of the year, at the end of the school year, he's like, are you going to continue teaching? He's like, no. He's like, he basically referred it basically as like the passion of teaching left him or departed when he had lost his daughter that day. And I didn't know that I would come into that kind of grief until a couple years later when my father was sick and he had passed. And then, like you mentioned earlier, in terms of not being an official, like certified counselor, I had to use those experiences. I work here at the college in the billing department. When in a similar circumstance, someone had called saying, when at the time when COVID was just beginning and people were getting sick with the original strain, the son was sick, in care. He was gravely ill. He had passed, and then the grandfather called saying, I want my what I pay for my grandson's tuition. I want my refund back. And I said, don't worry, I'll get you in touch with the parties that need be, and then we'll wipe off everything, all charges, and we'll refund your money accordingly. But yeah, I'm sorry. Again, I'm sorry for your loss. And it was tough. It was a really tough phone call. Because no one, like you said before, everyone always assumes that, a child should grow up, parents, age on, and the child should be burying the parents, not the other way around. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I'm imagining that you probably had another level of being able to relate to this person because of your own loss. Is that right? Yes. Mm-hmm. Were there any questions that had come in on the chat? Any comments? No. Okay. Right. Okay. Is anybody else who'd like to share anything? Great.
I think if you have experienced death of someone close, you need to expect that you will be hit at times you do not expect with a horrible sense of grief. And you'll say, where did this come from? My own experience was one day I dropped a glass on the kitchen floor and it broke. I get the dustpan out, I get down on my knees to clean it up, and I started crying, and I couldn't stop crying. It had nothing to do with the broken glass. It apparently just gave me an excuse soon after Tom's death to cry when I hadn't during that.
Yes, thank you, Mary Ellen. I had an experience somewhat similar to that a number of months after Gary had died. And I really thought that I was over the big crying, it's like, okay, I've cried myself out at this point. And then I was going through one of the kitchen drawers and I came across this cup that held, the plastic pieces that close off like a loaf of bread that you get in the grocery store. Well, Gary liked to save those, I don't know what he figured he was going to need like 200 of them for, but they were in this little cup in one of the drawers and it was forever like tipping over, and then a few would fall out of it and, you have to scoop them back up. So anyway, I thought, okay, there is no reason to have these anymore. I am going to just throw these out. And I did. I went over to the garbage pail, and as they fell into the garbage, I just was completely overcome with sobbing. I didn't walk to the garbage feeling that way, but as they spilled out into the garbage pail, it just completely flooded over me. Yeah.
Grief burst.
Right. A grief burst. Exactly.
When I was talking before about how everybody grieves differently and there's no right or wrong way, when Jim died, I have 2 daughters. Sarah, the oldest, when we were in the funeral home closing the casket before going to the church, she was kneeling at the casket, just clearly sobbing her little heart out. And Amy, who's here with us today, said, Sarah, he's gone. That's it. It's done. Daddy's gone. He's not coming back. I thought, Well, that's their personalities. But that's illustrates what I was saying about there's no one right way. And I just want everybody to feel secure in whatever it is for you. It's normal and it's okay.
As I said, I married a widower with 6 children. And the first Christmas, I went looking for the stockings and all the decorations. There were no stockings. I said, "Where are they?" And they say, "Oh, Tommy burned them when Claire died." Claire was their 12-year-old who had died some years before his wife had died. And I said, "Oh." So I made stockings overnight because we had to have stockings. All these little things caught me by surprise because it was the death of their mother, and their sister had never been coped with. No one ever helped them. I found out a good friend of theirs who was a priest came and said, "Stop crying. Just get on with your life," which is about the worst possible thing I can think of a clergyman saying. But I learned a lot from just these shocking discoveries of what they had not yet dealt with that later helped me when I had to deal with that too.
So my father passed away. I've had a lot of death in my family. Holidays seem to be getting fewer as time goes on. But my father passed away 20 years ago, and he died about 2 months, actually 2 months to the day that I graduated the college in New Rochelle. So I'm fortunate that he got to see me graduate. But I always think that we always grieve, and I don't think there's ever an end to grief. We just grieve differently as time goes on. But something also, the sense of smell, senses are very important. And I think the sense of smell sometimes brings memories back for him. I'll be walking in the store, grocery store, department store, and somebody will pass me by that may have worn a cologne that he wore. And all of a sudden it makes you think of him. And same thing, even with my grandfather, my grandmother, my uncle, and many people that have passed away in my family, sense of smell or just senses in general really remind you of someone. But I do think that we always grieve, and we never, it just changes over time.
That's like music. I think music triggers more memories than anything
Yep.
else. Hence my grief burst over my last wedding song. I think that's a big trigger.
Yeah, I agree, because the same thing happens. It's like sometimes like you're hearing a song when someone passes away, and now that song will always remind you of that person's death. Or another loss in your life, like you've mentioned, whether it's independent or something.
I don't know if we mentioned relief. And I think that's another one that's important, that we recognize that it's okay. So if someone is going through a catastrophic illness, you are relieved when that person passes away because they're out of pain, which I felt with my husband. Your suffering is over.
And to be honest, relief that you yourself are no longer going to have to be going to the hospital or changing the diapers or the what have you, of a seriously ill person. All those hands-on care type things which become exhausting, and there can be relief about that. Yeah. Eileen.
I think that one kind of death that people don't talk about enough, and certainly there are a lot of help groups for, but is suicide. And that the survivors the kind of, they've lost, again, many, many, many things when that happens. And they feel so guilty. The inability to understand. I've had a number of suicides on both sides of my paternal and maternal side. The inability to understand how a person could be in a place where they just don't think they can reach out for help, that it can't, they're totally hopeless. To understand how that feels, but to then provide comfort to a parent or to anybody who has been close to that person is, I think, very challenging. I don't know if you in your work have anything to offer to people about that.
Thanks for bringing that up, Eileen. I would like to just respond to that. A couple of the women in the book that I've written had spouses who took their own lives. And one of them had 2 teenage children at the time. And the suicide came as a total shock. No one had any idea that he was struggling with anything. It was just an incredibly total shock. Life had just been going along very smoothly. They were planning a vacation. He'd just gone out and bought oil to change the oil in the car, and total shock. So it was difficult for her and for the 2 children, but what she found really made the difference for her kids and for her is that she was very upfront about it, that this was a suicide. She did not hide the fact that he had taken his life. He didn't just, quote, die suddenly. He had died from suicide. So all that mystery surrounding it, all the shame, there was none. This is just happened to be how he died, and let's face it and be honest about it.
Mental health issues are in crisis right now, as we all know. And so, Eileen, I'm glad you mentioned the suicide, because there's so much attention on mental health currently because of all the crazy things in this world. My daughter's high school friend was married to a man, had a 3-year-old daughter, and he went off to work one morning and threw himself off an overpass on the highway and killed himself. He worshiped his wife, he worshiped his daughter, and at the funeral, it was the priest who said, we're not shaming suicide. We're not going to gloss over and pretend that he died any other way. And again, brought up the whole crisis of mental health in our society now. And I remember sitting in that church. I've been doing a lot of crying today, thinking how desperate he must have felt to do that and leave behind 2 people who he worshiped. So thank you for bringing that up.
I have a question from the Zoomers. How do I handle my mother telling me that she's ready to pass because she felt like her illness was a burden?
Yeah. Okay. I guess I will start by saying that again, none of us are therapists or grief counselors, but certainly this is a very difficult situation to have to deal with. Can we explain again what the question is? The mother has decided that she does not want to continue to live.
So her mother is telling her that she's ready to pass
Mhm.
because her illness is such a burden.
And the writer is wondering,
How does she, as the writer, respond to that?
respond. I think it's going to be different in any situation. I think it would be common for many people to try to respect the wishes of the mom. Just waiting for a mic to be delivered.
Thank you. Sorry, I had a neighbor like that. Well, she's still my neighbor, but it was a difficult decision because it gets complicated in terms of kind of have, when it comes to like, power of attorney, in terms of in the paperwork and the will and all the other forms, the parent had to decide or earlier beyond, before that, saying if I'm ever in this predicament where, they're on life support, who of her 3 children would ultimately make that decision, like, correct, if you don't wish to be, helped, by the medical staff, and like as his question said, or the question in the Zoom said, how do I acknowledge my parents' decision? I don't want the help. I'm ready to, you got to let me go. Ultimately, with that person, my neighbor who had the power of attorney to say, okay, you want this decision, I'm not going to fight you on it. I respect you. I admire, I want to thank you for what you did for me, but I have to correct. I will ultimately say, even though they have the power of attorney, they're not going to fight back against their parent. They said, if you wish to, be off the support, I will respect your wishes and I will inform the medical staff, to take you off the support. And it was not an easy decision. I mean, she still consulted with her other 2 brothers to say, this is what, our mother wants. She feels that, by just staying here in the hospital under medical support, we're just, she's basically, as the question alluded to, she's putting a burden on the family, even though, the family may not look at it that way. They'll say like, well, we'll do anything for our parents, but the mom's like, I don't want, I want to go, out on my own terms peacefully. And, they said, ultimately they decided, okay, we'll go, we'll let you go.
Yeah, thank you. And I think in a lot of those instances too, it can be helpful for the family to speak with the hospital social worker. There are professionals who can help families to be guided through this very difficult situation.
Just another perspective on this, having personal experience taking care of my mother. I think as parents age, the loss of independence really hurts them, and they don't want to see their children burdened taking care of them, because that's not the natural way. It's usually the other way around. But I think one of the things that can be done is to reassure people that they're not a burden, that you're doing this out of love, and just show them that, because I think it's just a very difficult time getting old, and we're all going to get there. Just being very caring and helping them with things like
I
that.
think another thing that is helpful for those of us who are here, if you have a will, if you don't have a will, make a will and put in your will in writing how you wish to be handled at the end of your life. That really helps people who are making the decisions.
I have worked in hospice and palliative care for a number of years, and in a hospital setting, not in a home setting. And I think, as you said just now, Mary Ellen, in terms of, yes, having the piece of paper, but, and I know we've all heard this, and you don't have to raise your hand if you've done it or not done it, but the bigger thing is to have that conversation with the people who you are identifying as your power of attorney. And it is sometimes difficult when there's more than one child or more than one person who will be helping with that decision. And just a little aside, when people mention a mother and that difficulty, or a parent for that matter, I think one thing is important to tell that person who is saying, I've had enough of this. It's okay if I die now. As a child, let them know that you will be okay. And that's a little bit different switch than what they're looking for. They also want to know that you're going to be okay. But many people who are ill, they want to know that whoever is going to be surviving them will be okay, because I think they have severe doubts about that. Yeah.
Thanks, Sue. You've got really pertinent experience with that.
You know, in our family, you know, we have one of everything and everyone. And so it's important that we all be on the same page of what we want for ourselves as we get older, to have those conversations when we're not in crisis, to say, hey, you know, I really don't want this, or I don't want that, and it may change. So you may have to have an update so that communication, families are difficult, you know, and sometimes you got to put in the work, and sometimes it's very hard.
I think we'll take just one more comment and then we'll have to move on so we don't run out of time here.
I
Uh,
just, okay, somebody? Okay.
Maybe,
I just wanted to comment on the list that whoever made it up about loss of a marriage, reputation, identity, all the things that were listed. I came here thinking, of course, it was going to be about death, you know, the loss of somebody. But the losses mentioned are really, you know, touched me deeply. How many of us have shared or know people who have had those kinds of losses, and how difficult that I'm grateful whoever put the list together included them as a part of this, because absolutely to have a loss of reputation or a relationship or your home, any of these job, any of these things have a profound lasting impact. So thank you all for putting that out too. I appreciate it.
I think at this point, we will move on to the next topic. I know there are probably a couple more people who have questions or comments. If you can hang on to those until we've done this next piece, and then we will get back to some more time for sharing. Okay. So let's see. In just a few minutes, Mary Ellen is going to talk about some of the ways that we can try to promote healing and resilience. But just very briefly, we're going to talk about the fact that mourning is really tough work. About 30 years ago, J. William Worden devised a listing of the 4 tasks that we have to complete in mourning. This was sort of an alternate way of looking at grief, alternate from Kubler-Ross's very well received theory of grief. And Worden's work is still very well received and well respected. He talks about accepting the reality of the loss. We can't keep denying it or just wishing it away. The person has died, the job has been lost, the home has been destroyed. We need to accept the reality of it. We may not be able to accept it immediately, but eventually we have to absorb the reality of the loss. And as Gert was talking about earlier, working through the pain of the grief, and not trying to run away from the grief, it's painful. It's hard to grieve, but we need to feel that pain and work through it. His third step is adjusting to an environment where this person, if we're speaking about a loss due to death, accepting an environment where the deceased person is missing. This person's never going to be there again. They're not going to walk back in the door at the end of the day. They're not going to be sitting in the living room watching TV with us tonight. You know, that person is gone. The way things are supposed to be just isn't. We've got to work toward accepting that notion. And then his fourth step is finding an enduring connection to whoever we've lost. And that might be done in a number of ways. We might find some way to honor the person's memory. So just as that is our framework for trying to cope with mourning and with grief. I'm going to hand it over to Mary Ellen. She's going to delve into some actual strategies that people have found helpful. And we're hoping that you all, when we have our discussion period, will be able to offer some ideas of your own.
I'm going to make this much more a reading of a list rather than discussing them at length. Some of them I covered when I was talking about my own experience. Thank you. Some of these I covered when I was talking about my own experience. I'm a reader. I did an awful lot of reading. Any book I could find on grief, I read. There's a wonderful one called Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Tom Fox, which is irreverent, absolutely wild and crazy. And it was in this particular book, grief appears as a huge crow that pecks on the door one day and flaps into the family house and just messes up everything. But it's a wonderful allegory about grief and death. I did as much reading as I could, and then I found that I needed to read something about brave women, not necessarily dealing with death, but I needed to get out of myself. And so I decided to read about the resistance in the Second World War in England and France. And they were really brave women, just took their lives in their hands every night to go out and blow up a bridge so the Nazis could not get into the next village. You know, really crazy things. I found it wonderfully helpful. I wasn't going to do that kind of stuff. I'm not brave, but it was just really helpful to read that. I think you need to, above all, be very patient with the process of grieving. It takes a long time and it's different for every personality. If you have people you're comfortable talking with, do that. I'm not someone who would have immediately done anything but run away from being involved in a grief group. But the Visiting Nurse Association had a grief counselor call me once a month for a year. And she said, do that. Go to a group. So I went to one at St. Ignatius Loyola Church because I wanted something that had to do with faith as well for me. And what I learned was to listen and to hear how awful the suffering of other people was. And somehow it took me out of myself. So all of these things that were helpful to me were basically things that took me out of myself and started thinking about other people. Neither Sloan Kettering nor Bellevue would accept me back to be a volunteer until I think it was 6 months to a year had elapsed. That is their, at least in Manhattan, their time if you have the death of a spouse before they will put you in a similar circumstance. But I miss not being able to do volunteer work, and I found it very helpful to be able to get back at that. Write, keep some kind of a journal. It doesn't have to be every day, but and I don't mean type, I mean longhand writing. There's something about going from here down through your hand and arm that is very helpful. I also draw, and I did a lot of artwork during that time. Unrelated to Tom's death, but it was not unrelated to what I needed to express. So if you have that kind of inclination, if you play an instrument, if you gave up piano lessons in the 4th grade, start again. You know, it's another, learn something new, try a new language, or a new hairstyle. Try one new thing. That's a very helpful thing too. Go for walks, spend a lot of time in nature, and not just walking, but stopping and looking at a bunch of dandelions. Actually stopping and looking and absorbing and paying attention brings you down to focus on, and once you bring your focus on a thing like a dandelion, it sort of works for the rest of you too. And I always came back refreshed from that kind of a walk. Sleep and eat well. If you can't sleep, talk to a doctor, get whatever professional help you need. Keep routines. Get up at the same time. I'm a 5 o'clock a.m. riser. I fade at night, but I continue to do that, and I found it very helpful just to keep some of those basic routines in my life. I mentioned the teddy bear. Clinically, I learned later on, has a name. It's called a transitional object. And little kids do it with toy cars and teddy bears. It's an object that moves you away, in that case, from the parent to begin to do something on your own. I'm not saying you have to buy a teddy bear, but I found it very helpful to even know there was a name for that I was normal. You know, I needed things to tell me I was normal. That was very helpful. Accept that loss is an unavoidable aspect of life. In many ways. If you have another way, pay kindnesses forward. During the time after my husband died, so many people were kind to me. I lived in an apartment building in Manhattan. The concierge at the front desk, all the people on the staff were so kind to me. Mrs. McEvely, anything you need, you call us. So I tried to pay attention to them, say, how's your family? How's your little kid? Just stop. And very simple ways of repaying kindnesses. Consider a support group is on this list. I really resisted that, but as I said, I did eventually do it because the visiting nurse counselor told me to do it. And it was really good because I said, okay, you're not the only one in the world suffering. You know, it did that for me. Put lots of things in perspective. Plus, the people were very kind to each other. That was very helpful too. I think there are probably times when there are some people who cannot get through grief, perhaps without professional help. And there's plenty of professional help. And I think asking for help is a very hard thing to do often, but really in this case, very beneficial, very beneficial. Try to get a balance between solitude and being with friends or family. If you are inclined to be out all the time, and be sure you have some time for solitude. I'm on the other end of that, and I need to push myself to be out and meet somebody for coffee. COVID messed up a lot of stuff like that. Because you couldn't just go out and have lunch with someone. But if someone is still in a grief period at this point, remember you can do that now. And even though it's too cold to sit outside probably and have lunch, just meeting somebody for coffee and walking around with Dunkin' Donuts coffee or something is a very good thing to do, because you're in contact with other people. Let's see. I think most of the other things have been covered. Just constantly be patient with yourself. There is no timeline for this, and patience, even patience, with I did some stupid thing, like, as I mentioned, drop the glass on the kitchen floor. I mean, it's not the end of the world. So clean it up and don't think, oh, what made me do that? I shouldn't do that again. I'll have to be extra careful. Just let a whole bunch of things go, if at all possible. Keep life as simple as possible.
I wanted to respond to your comments about having a transitional object. I found what was very helpful for me after Gary died is that somebody gave me, I'm sure maybe some of you have one of these. It was a very chunky, smooth cross made out of wood. I kept that under my pillow at night, and I could just, reach under my pillow, grab it and hang on to it. And I will admit that there were times when I actually wanted to suck my thumb. Though I did, I wanted to suck my thumb. I didn't go that far. But having that cross under my pillow was very comforting, something to hang on to. I actually, at times, I felt like it was a substitute for holding hands. So, yeah, they can be really, really helpful.
On this topic, I just keep thinking about my mother, from whose wisdom I have benefited my whole life. She's 96 and a half, and she wakes up every day and opens her eyes and says, "Oh, good, I'm still here." And then she says, "I don't want to die anytime soon, but I'm not afraid of it." And the reason she's not afraid of it is because she will have all the answers. She's been a voracious reader her whole life, and a very devout Catholic her whole life. And she wants to make sure that all the stuff she's believed throughout her life is actually true.
So we're going to take, how are we doing for time, Tara? Oh, good. Okay. So we'll take a little bit of time. Maybe some of you have things along these lines you'd like to share. Let's see, do we have one down there? Thank you.
Thank you. I was just thinking about all of the times that I held the patient's hands, that there would be so much emotion of the patients that just, what can I do to be with them? And I would hold their hands. We would cry together. We would be together. And some of them died, but they were not alone.
Hey, one of the things that r- the when I saw the invitation for this um, about universal loss and grief, um, uh, the reason why I really saw it and said, okay, I'm really going to come to this to hear what people are saying is I had a friend who I recently lost. Um, I'm 31 years old now. I met him when I was 15, when I moved here from the Bronx to New Rochelle, and we went to New Rochelle High School together. His name was Steven. Um, we lived on Elm Street together. Um, he got hit by a car recently, and he lost his life. And he's a really close friend of mine. We dated some of the same girls. We played on the same rugby team. Um, I assisted his first try scored. Um, I got him to play along with me, and it was I spent a lot of more time with him than I did with my own brother in some ways, or with my own family, my own cousins and relatives. I spoke more to him on the phone and spent a lot of time with him. I even know his mom and his sister and his cousins too. And just like the grief that I'm experiencing with his loss is more than I've ever experienced with anyone. You know, I spent a lot of time with him. He's just a really, really good friend of mine, and to lose him is extremely difficult. One of the things that really makes it difficult too is um, before it happening, I sat down with him and his family, and we had fish and chips at an Irish bar, uh, and something that we're familiar with, playing rugby together with him, and it was just really it's a really tough thing to deal with. Sometimes I feel like I'm never gonna get out of the feeling of grief, and you know, it like you said, it kind of just comes out of nowhere sometimes. Like you know, um, but like a clock, you gotta move with it, and it does. It's a tough thing to deal with, but and I just want to say thank you for sharing this information with me because it's exactly what I need to hear, and it's helpful.
And I want to thank you. First of all, I'm very sorry for your loss. And it's fresh and new for you. So thank you for coming today. And thank you for also bringing up the issue of losing a friend. I think what frequently happens when there's a death is that everyone flocks around the family. And all of, the first attention is on the loss to the family, and the friends are often left on the periphery. But a death of a friend can be tremendously impactful. And when it happens to us, we need to give ourselves the permission to grieve. I wish you luck with that, Miriam.
I'd like to add to another forgotten group. Oh, when I was 16, I had an aunt who died at the age of 33 very suddenly, and her husband and her 3 children came to live with our family. My mother suddenly had a 13-month-old baby, 5 and a 6-year-old, plus my brother who was 7, and me. And everybody knew that these little kids had to be taken care of, and everybody flocked around them. But I felt as if nobody thought that me at 16, I knew her. I loved her deeply, and nobody ever said anything to me. So I think that's important. Remember that the person who could be the forgotten one, in any kind of situation, that's just one, who may also be grieving, somebody you didn't even know was a friend of the person who died. Pay attention to them too.
You knew your friends since New Rochelle High School, right? And 16 years? Do you have mutual friends where you grew up together, you were in high school and you continue on? Now, okay. Do you all get together and talk about, what's your friend's name? Steve? Steve. Do you, Stephen? Stephen. Do you all get together and talk about Stephen, about things you did together and fun you had and what you miss? You do.
Uh, in a way, for me, it's like, it's so hard to, because um, it's really hard to to actually be doing that because of just it just all of the memories that I have with him are just so, it's very overwhelming to think about. Like, I had anticipated doing so many more things with him, like he would definitely be at my wedding, or I just imagined that I would have dinner with him again one day, and just I was looking forward to the next time that I would see him again when I last saw him. And for there to not be another instance like that, to me is just is very devastating. And then to reflect on it too, in a way, I prefer to do it by myself. Just I for some reason I prefer to reflect on everything with him by myself. I've done it with people, but in a way I feel better about who I'll be, um, just in my future, uh, by consulting with um, his family that I know, and that I've done. I've been to his relatives' house, and I spoke to them the most about this, just because I feel like um, they would give me the most responsible um, ways um, to digest it all. I mean, that's just a personal choice of mine.
I have a question from a Zoomer. Do you have any advice on advisability of clearing departed spouse's office/belongings or moving from the house you shared over many years?
Can I just make one comment to him before we switch? I just wanted to say to you, maybe one thing that might comfort you is to know that by you sharing that time with your friend's family, with Stephen's family, for them to know how much you love him, and that could be very deeply comforting to them, to know that his influence over people wasn't just with the family, but that deep bond is such a compliment to your friend. He must have been a really fine person.
Thank you for sharing all that. And to get to the question from someone on Zoom, clearing out the office of a departed spouse, and the question of whether or not to move. I'll take the second part of that first. There is kind of a rule of thumb that when there's been a death, that it's not advisable to make a big change, such as moving for at least a year. It's a rule of thumb, there are so many other things to be coming to terms with. And I think the thinking is, let's try to maintain some things in life with stability, and having the home still be a stable place. It is one of those ways. Having said that, there are lots of people who find it intolerable to live in the same house that they had shared with the spouse or any other person in the family who has died. So this all has to happen on a case-by-case basis. But to do it with a lot of thought and perhaps with input from other people who could also help to guide you along that process. Clearing out the office, that's a biggie. I faced that when my own husband died. He had a home office, and it was a chore. It was a huge chore. I think anybody who's had to clear up for someone who has died, whether it was a spouse or not, finds that that can be a very daunting task, which just has to be taken little by little, by little by little. I found in my own case to not do it all at once was the only way to go. I would tackle it, one afternoon at a time, and then give myself lots of time to take a break from it. That was my way. Others might say, I'm just going to dive in and get this all done. I don't want it hanging over me. So again, listen to your own self, listen to what works for you. There isn't any right or wrong way to do it. Does anybody else want to speak to that question?
I was going to say that the thrust of my participating in this today was to try to convey that whatever works for you is what is right, that there is no right or wrong way. And I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again with each question that's asked. If being by yourself and memorializing your friend works for you, then that's great. Our feeling was to offer strategies and our own experiences and things for you to think about when you're going through a loss, and then take away from this what you will and do what feels best for you. I remember getting rid of my ex-husband's things. Again, I had to do it twice because I cleaned out his apartment and brought everything home. I got some pretty good paintings out of that, by the way. And but getting rid of his things, and I remember so vividly having a jacket of his, and it was like he was here. But I got rid of it. It was time. It was time. So whatever works for you is what we wish for you, or at least I do.
And I think, just in the interest of staying within our time frame, we'll move on to really the final stage of this get together, which is to listen, to reflect on some quotations by some people who were more famous than we are. And we're each going to take a turn. I'm feeling like this is not working. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we're each going to take a turn. I'm going, and we're just going to read them and ask you to just try to absorb what you're hearing. Maybe one will resonate with you. Maybe all of them will resonate with you. Maybe none will. But they're all geared toward hope and healing. And here we go. I'm going to read something from Richard Rohr. Perhaps some of you have heard of him. He's the founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation. And he writes, "Hope is the patient and trustful willingness to live without full closure, without resolution, and still be content and even happy. because our satisfaction is now at another level and our source is beyond ourselves. I'm going to read that just a second time because there's a lot caught up in those words. And second time around, they may be more meaningful. Hope is the patient and trustful willingness to live without full closure, without resolution, and still be content and even happy because our satisfaction is now at another level and our source is beyond ourselves.
I would ask that you close your eyes and clear your mind. Take a good couple of deep breaths. This is by Martha Hickman from a book called Healing After Loss. Can we try even a little bit to believe in spring? To believe in its witness to the economy of creation, that nothing is lost, nothing is wasted, and that our loved one too, is transformed into new life. If we can believe that, then the abundance we see around us can give us courage and hope, as well as a nourishing feast for our senses here and now.
I'm going to read a quotation from a poem by the Sufi mystic and poet Rumi. It's called Bird Wings. Your grief for what you've lost lifts a mirror up to where you're bravely working. Expecting the worst, you look, and instead, here's the joyful face you've been wanting to see. Your hand opens and closes and opens and closes. If it were always a fist or always stretched open, you would be paralyzed. The deepest presence is in every small contracting and expanding. Two as beautifully balanced and coordinated as bird wings.
So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we really want to thank all of you for being here to be part of it. But before we go, I just want to introduce Rosa Napoleon, and she's going to, I have to say something about you first. She's from the class of 75 and did so much with Nancy Harkins, who's also here, to keep our class together over the years, especially these last few years of COVID. Rosa is the co-lead, along with Marlene Tutera, on the CNR Legacy Council, and she's going to wrap things up for us today.
Thank you, Carol. On behalf of the CNR Legacy Council, I would like to thank you all for being here to listen, to learn, and to share. Our hope has been that by shining a light on universal loss and grief, we can help to promote healing for ourselves and for those we love. We are truly grateful to Carol, Catherine, aka Gert, and Mary Ellen for guiding our conversation today and for sharing their experiences. A special thanks goes out to my Legacy Council co-chair, Marlene Tutera, for her leadership in bringing this event to fruition. Finally, we offer our gratitude to Tara Alfano for her endless support, to her wingman, Noel Melitza, and to Mercy College, without whom this session would not have been possible. Through sponsorship of this lifelong enrichment program, the CNR Legacy Council is striving to keep the spirit of CNR alive among our alumni by paying tribute to the legacy of someone who was practically synonymous with CNR. Sister Dorothy Ann's presence has been felt among us today, and she is most likely looking down on us with wholehearted approval of this inaugural session that honors her memory. In the coming weeks, we will be planning our next event to be held in the spring, and will share details in a timely manner. If anyone has any ideas for future events, please send them in an email to cnralumni@mercy.edu. Thank you all again for coming. I hope this has been helpful, and have a great weekend. Thank you.